Vasishta continued, when, obstinately clinging to a fancy, and therefore abandoning a thorough inquiry into the nature of truth, one apprehends an object with that fancy, such apprehension is described as conditioning or limitation. In other words, when you get focused on something, and when you get focused on something that you're attracted to, that's a fancy, then this is conditioning or limitation. The awareness becomes that object, that person, that notion. When such fancy is persistently and intensely indulged in, this world appearance arises in consciousness. Well, it's really notions of a world appearance that arise in consciousness. It cannot be anything else. Caught up in his own conditioning, whatever the person sees, he thinks that to be real and gets deluded. And on account of the intensity of the conditioning and the fancy, he discards his own nature and perceives only the world delusion. So you can put in anything you like as your object of fantasy. Some are stronger than others. Some are extremely deep-rooted, especially ones of a sexual nature, for example. Fetishes, that's the kind of power we're talking of here, the power of illusion. And we can see how restricting it is or how limiting it is, because everything disappears as we follow our fetish. It's a slightly uncomfortable word, fetish, isn't it? But I think it might be a better word to use than craving. Craving sounds a little bit remote, a little bit psychological. It doesn't quite hit home the same way as the word fetish does. Fetish is the nature of craving. All this happens only to the unwise person. Well, I'm sure it happens to the wise person at times as well. But when it does happen, the wise person becomes unwise. That whose perception is thus perverted is known as mind. Fetish is mind created, isn't it? That's quite clear. It's not just human beings, animals are into fetish as well. And they can be focused on anything really. When this mind is confirmed in its perverted perception, it becomes a seed for repeated birth, old age and death. It's perverted perception. It's perverted not in, we're not talking in some kind of moralistic term here, in terms of sexual perversion or whatever. It's perverted in the sense that it's been turned around, it's been turned on its head. We've been sold shoddy goods. We've turned away from the expansive nature, the all-encompassing nature of our own awareness, and focused it on one little thing, and that little thing has become the object of our slavering desires. That's why it's perverted. When notions of the desirable and undesirable do not arise, then the mind does not arise and there is supreme peace. And this is what the yogi is interested in, isn't he? Supreme peace. It's not the interest of the one practicing self-inquiry, although it follows, supreme peace follows. These alone constitute the form of the mind: conception, imagination, thought and memory. When these are absent, how does a mind exist? So the yogi, the traditional yogi, is concerned with the extinction of the mind, which is not the concern of the one practicing self-inquiry. The one practicing self-inquiry wants to be free from the notions of the mind, but isn't interested in extinguishing the mind. It's rather like trying to cut off your hand. And conception, imagination, thought and memory. Well, what about emotions? What about moods? What about our underlying psychological tendencies? I think this gets addressed in a minute. When these are absent, how does the mind exist? When one established in non-becoming, in other words, we're not feeding new notions, we're not feeding our involvement in notions. When one established in non-becoming contemplates that which has not changed into becoming, and when one thus perceives what is as it is, then the mind becomes no mind. The mind becomes no mind. It's a much better way than saying the mind is extinguished or killed or whatever, or conquered. When the psychological conditioning or limitation is not dense, when it has become transparent, one becomes a liberated sage who apparently lives and functions by past momentum, even as a potter's wheel rotates after the initial impulse has been withdrawn. But he will not be born again. Again, this is another yogic notion, the idea that we're going to get born again in this endless cycle of death and reincarnation. If you're interested in, if you're following self-inquiry, then this is of no relevance. You certainly don't want to be born again in the sense that you're going to get caught up in your notions, but that's almost inevitable, but it will become weaker. This tendency will become weaker with practice. In his case, the seed has been fried, as it were, and will not germinate into world illusion. When the body falls, he is absorbed into the infinite. Absorbed into the infinite. This is a yogic point of view. The yogi of self-inquiry, though, already realizes that he is absorbed in the infinite. It's not it's not an event that happens. So we need to be careful then about traditional yoga and the practice of the yoga of self-inquiry. They're quite separate things, but the language is similar. We shouldn't confuse one with the other. But the yoga of self-inquiry arose within the context of traditional yoga. And although they're quite separate things, there is a tendency for the language used to confuse the two.